Hi, and welcome to the Orgdev podcast. So what happens on a change project when the internal team, the external consultants, and the client are all pulling in different directions, but nobody's saying it out loud? And what if the real problem isn't the project plan, it's the unspoken dynamics between the people trying to deliver it? Today's guest has spent her career making sense of exactly those moments and helping organisations navigate the relational complexity that so often sits underneath strategy, structure, and change. We're absolutely delighted to be joined by Sophy Pern. She's an international consultant, facilitator, executive coach, and one of the founding partners of European boutique consultancy Ammalo. Sophy is one of 3 founding partners. She works with executive leaders and teams on strategy engagement, organisation design, operating models, culture change, and team development. In recent years, she's supported global organisations such as Domino's Pizza, Sandoz, Nexan, and Brittany Ferries. Her practice is founded on the understanding that change happens at individual, team, and organisational levels, and always in the context of relationships. Sophy co-founded Metalog, and she was also a corporate client director at Ashridge Business School, and she's held senior positions in other consultancies and worked for BP in France, Algeria, and the UK, as well as living and working in Japan. Naturally, all of her extensive professional experience is underpinned by academic qualifications. She has a law degree from Cambridge, a master's in organisation consultant from Ashridge, and gained the Tavistock certificate in coaching for leadership. And Sophy is based in Madrid. She's fluent in French and brings a truly cosmopolitan approach to her work. So thank you so much for joining us, Sophy, on a very hot Friday afternoon. So thank you.
Thank you for having me. And I see your UK heat and I raise you our Spanish heat. So.
This is technically siesta time for you now, isn't it?
Well, haven't had lunch yet or got to siesta, but I think I'll be able to stay awake for a little bit. Thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here.
So Garen's done a bit of an intro there, but just tell us a bit more about the work you do. What's your focus? What does your work involve?
So all sorts, whole range of clients. So I often get asked, do you have a sector focus? And my answer is always no, because actually we're paying attention to what goes on between and across people, and that's not necessarily sector specific. But typically it will be working with leaders who are leading or in the middle of some significant change or transformation, and helping them think about, well, strategically, where do we need to go? Who do we need to be going there with? So how do I think about what team I need to have around me and what role we play in those teams? How might we need to organize? And how is culture going to trip us up? And therefore, what might we need to pay attention to in that culture space? So those types of pieces of work, often very internationally. So I often, and it may be something to do with my own history, find myself working with teams that are covering multiple geographies or include people who from different nationalities across, as I say, whole host of sectors, usually European headquartered. I guess Europe is home for me and us at Ammalo in some way, but it can take us further afield from that.
And, we've interviewed, I think, 75 people now for the podcast, and all under the kind of umbrella of organisation development. What does organisation development mean to you? What's your particular flavour of organisation development?
It's a great question. I think I probably had a slightly unusual path into OD, because I think quite a lot of people come to OD after a first type of career, whether it's project management or strategy or HR or something, and then they get interested in how do organizations work, and then they sort of get more and more into OD. And actually for me, luck and circumstance had it that I was working in BP in their graduate development program quite early in my career, probably age 23, 24, and I fell into this OD team. And I thought, you know what, this is what I want to be when I grow up. And I was, 24. Everybody's going, well, what are you going to do career-wise? And actually, the OD space just made a lot of sense to me. And I think I'd always been interested in, as a teenager, how does society work? So I education in France, you do philosophy and economics and sociology and history and geography. And I really enjoyed that, looking at society through different lenses. And OD has some of that, looking at organisation and what's going on, but through different lenses. To me, it is about that individuals, teams, systems, never being stuck in just one lens and one perspective, I think is probably what I love about it, what I continue to find interesting, fascinating. And so, yeah, I think I've probably been very lucky to fall into the field quite early and stay there.
I think you might be just our second person who's said that. I think we've got
Second,
one other person
yep.
who said, I knew from a very young age. And what about that interplay between organisation development and organisation design? How does that show up in your work?
I think one of my favourite stories about that was a colleague of mine at Ashridge who joined Ashridge Consulting to do OD, and 3 months in discovered that actually at Ashridge they meant organisation development, and she thought it meant organisation design, and she'd got all the way through the recruitment process and 3 months in before working out that actually there were two different Ds going on here. To me, there is broad organisation development, of which design is a part, and a really important part, and that, and sometimes perhaps underplayed. And in fact, we had some conversations. I know you were with Toby Lindsay last week, but we had some conversations over the last 2-3 years about this notion of suits and cardigans, and the OD development folk perhaps sometimes over focusing on the psychodynamics and the psychology, and sometimes the design folk maybe perhaps over focusing on structure. But I see them as completely intertwined and different sides of a same coin. If I'm being purist, I think about development and design as a subset, but it's not something I can die in a ditch over. I do think it's important to pay attention to both. And we talk quite a lot at Ammalo about this idea of dynamics and design. You can't, it's a both and, not an either or.
One of the things you mentioned in your introduction there is that you're often quite heavily involved in transformations, and that's a kind of a term that many organisations are kind of grappling with, but not all transformations are equal.
No.
What are the sort of the breadth of different kind of transformations that you support?
Oh, it's a good question. I think transformation is one of those really interesting words, a bit like strategy, that often means different things to different people. So one of the things that I hold in mind is, is this fundamental change versus evolution? Neither is right or wrong, but it's helpful to be clear. And how is it being framed and thought about at a senior, probably executive team level? And then which levers are people leaning into? So I get quite twitchy when a transformation becomes a transformation office. Not that there's anything wrong with transformation offices, but I sometimes notice them turning into quite controlling functions and perhaps unwittingly reinforcing some of the changes that might need to be made. Where my work often takes me is questions for an exec team around what did we used to believe, what do we no longer believe, what needs to be true in the world that we're thinking about, which then quite often does get you into questions of design. So, if we fundamentally used to believe that this capability was critical, but now it's this one, how do we organize around that? A good example of that would be a generics business going, well, actually, if historically our R&D and customer intimacy was where we really made a difference, actually as a generics business, those may not be the key capabilities. As a generics business, maybe the key capabilities are that operational efficiency. So what needs to be true? What do we need to be paying attention to? And that feels transformative to me. We're believing something different about the business we're in and the context we're in. Has a whole load of consequences, but that's where I see transformation being significant. And that's probably where I end up playing the work that I do.
I really like what you're saying there, because it's sort of adding a precision to it and a definition to it so that people agree before we go forwards. Often transformations, they could be all types of different transformations, but are you finding that many sort of senior teams don't do that groundwork up front to make sure that we're all aligned in terms of what we're trying to create? And I love what you're saying there in terms of what it was and what we want to be as well. So we're all kind of crisply aligned.
Absolutely. And I think, so the answer to your question is yes, I probably do see, well, I'd like to say the teams I work with don't forget to do that, because I'd like to think that part of my role is to make that happen. But that may be me being judge and jury. I think where I hear about and see teams struggling is sometimes actually that collective sense making and processing hasn't been done, and we've outsourced the thinking and the processing of that to someone else, and it's been presented to the leadership team,
Mm.
but not necessarily worked through as a team. And that is probably where I see quite a bit of the struggle. So we've been told that, and even at a senior leadership team, we've been told that the strategy is now this, and this is what it means. And it looks good on paper and rationally makes sense, but we haven't actually processed what that might really mean for us. So that kind of collective sense making, looking at the picture, what might it mean? Therefore, what might we need to do? I think teams sometimes skip over that in terms of the pace. I was with a CEO this morning, well, my colleague and I were the CEO this morning, and she said, at the moment, it's like a pizza. At the moment, your leadership team are all sitting on their bit of pizza, managing their bit of pizza, but nobody's actually seeing the whole pizza and feeling accountable for the whole pizza. I like jigsaw puzzles more than pizzas, but I do think there's something in that, seeing the whole system, understanding the whole system, and doing it together.
An optional question for you. This is just professional curiosity. So, because to transform means that something from the past is not right. And so, so
not right, or it's no longer needed. It may be different.
I guess it depends how it's felt, isn't it, within the organisation? So it's like new is good, transformation office, transformation director, whoever it is, and yet people in the organisation that have worked incredibly hard to get the organisation to where it is.
Yeah.
How do you kind of honour the past to bring those people on board?
That's a really good question. And actually, a while ago, we did some research when I was one of the partners at Metalog, and we did some research into the different metaphors that underpinned transformations. And I think there was something really helpful in that. And actually, I think a criticism I would have is too often leaders jump to the cliched metaphors that are out there. So you must win battles, you're burning platforms, and they're fine, but they may not actually be right for the reality of that organization. So if I think about an organization I did a lot of work with over a number of years, when you stopped and thought about it, really the metaphor that the CEO was holding in mind for the transformation, and it was a transformation that he has led and continues to lead, was of renovating a really beautiful old house. And the way he talked about it, that's what came through. So he talked about, this is a beautiful old house. We love it. It's a bit unusual. It's a bit quirky. The plumbing doesn't always work great. And by the way, the wiring, perhaps we need to pay attention to it. But it is a beautiful old house, and we need to hold on to the spirit and the soul of the house as we improve it. Well, that's very different from burning platform and the past is bad. So paying real attention to what's the metaphor and what are the messages of the metaphor, I think is really helpful, and helping leaders to be really conscious about what metaphors they choose, what the unintended consequences of some of those metaphors might be. But another client I'm working with at the moment, there's a piece about how they can be more agile. There's a lot of work for them to do in the digital space, and we've just started exploring it. And the phrase that comes around is, and then we create treacle. And a question I'm holding for myself is, this could become useful organizational language. It could become quite a fun code word. Oh, there's more treacle. How can we cut through the treacle, move it? But then the other bit I'm thinking about is the treacle makers who are doing an important thing on behalf of the organization might not feel great about being described as the treacle makers. So how do we think about that? How we thought? I don't know if that's a good answer to the optional question.
No, it's fantastic, and I'm sure you'll probably
a cut. It might not.
No, that one's going to that will proudly stay.
Really good.
Well, yeah, because I think what I love, for example, what you're saying about with the old home that we love, what it does, it kind of sort of says that there's a lot of things that are not in scope, and we all appreciate the beauty of what we have. But we can all agree that the plumbing doesn't work, can't we?
Yeah.
And so what it does, it kind of sort of says, well, let's work on that. And then you can get that kind of agreement, but we know what's in scope and out of scope as well. So I think there's something that's really, because often the temptation is to bring, it's new, and, it often comes in with others that are sort of saying, one of the classic things about regime change is to sort of say,
out with the old.
But you, like you're sort of saying, the people, the treacle makers, the unsung heroes of many organizations are the ones that really hold the things together. So how can we respect them as well?
Yeah. And really honor what people care about.
Hi, we're just pausing this interview for a moment. Have you ever finished an episode of the Orgdev podcast and wish you had a cheat sheet that summarises all of the key points? Us too, so we made one. It's called From Pod to Practice, and each week in our newsletter we'll share a 2-page summary of the latest Orgdev episode, and it includes key takeaways, a reflection prompt, and one small action you can try.
And it's all in a digital format with space at the end to add your own notes and reflections, and it's designed to help you take the learning from the podcast into your day-to-day work. So to get your copy, just sign up to our Next Step to Better newsletter. The link's in the show notes, or you can visit our website at www.distinction.live to get the latest From Pod to Practice in your inbox. And let us know what you think. We'd love to get your feedback.
You know, what was your journey into OD? So that you sort of mentioned finding it at BP. What was your journey from here to now?
So education, very interested in the social sciences. So by the time I got out of university, I dabbled in all of those. Established I'd be a really bad solicitor. So that was, helpful clarification. If you have a law degree from Cambridge, it's useful to know that you shouldn't go and try and become a magic circle solicitor. And thought, well, I better do something. I ended up joining BP on graduate development program with the view that probably allowed some mix of disciplines, which I guess there's something about that that's always been appealing. Found myself in this European OD team. And there was just, again, luck, some really deeply skilled OD folk around. So I think about a Neil Samuels, a Brian Wishart, some people who are, probably now retired, but they had real vision around the need to develop that capability for BP. So they brought Chris Worley over to teach us OD for a week. I just thought, oh, that's nice to join, nice chap. And then now I'm like, oh, that was not sure I appreciated the significance of that.
That's not normal. That isn't normal.
Not normal. So it's not, everybody's not doing this. Oh. So I'm very lucky to have some great grounding and mentorship early in career. And then they, at the time, BP had a open job sourcing platform, and this role came up in Algeria, of all places, and it was called Organisational Capability Advisor. And I applied, and essentially it was a joint venture between BP, Sonatrach, and Statoil. And a key question was, how do we develop more national Algerian capability to take on these roles? Because it's part of the contracts that we, give back to the country who you have the agreement with. So I applied for this role, aged about 25, 26, and they did a phone interview with me. And then they said, well, you should probably come visit before you say yes. And I'm okay, fine. Because this role was a 3 weeks on, 3 weeks off, a little bit like being offshore. And tramped my way into Gatwick at 4 a.m. in the morning for a charter flight out to Hasima Sound. And I looked around and I realized I was not normal for this place. And it was largely older. There was a lot of drillers. There were a lot of mechanical process engineers, etc. There weren't many other women. In fact, there might have been none. And there weren't any people who were under 30. So I guess that's why they wanted me to come and visit. I ended up doing 2-3 years out there working on how we set up the operation, how we developed staff, how we designed, all those kind of things. And it was an amazing sandbox, because I got to say to the nice people in BP that none of the stuff they suggested could be used here because we were a joint venture. And as long as I could build the relationships and credibility with the business leaders in Algeria, they go, well, that sounds sensible, let's try it. So I had enormous scope and things to play with. Again, unusually and early in career, in quite an unusual context. So I did de bono 6 hats, various just fun things. And then from there, ended up going back and doing a master's in change and consulting, ended up working at Ashridge Business School, doing some teaching, but a lot of consulting work, creating Metalog, a lot of consulting work there. And so it carried on. And I probably towards around sort of 30 established that much as I loved being in a big organization, I probably had quite high autonomy needs, and consulting in many ways was a more comfortable place for that, because there's variety, which has always been really fascinating to me. There's something about pace. You have to go in and pick things up quite quickly and determine quite quickly where you might need to intervene. You hold a different role, and we might talk about this a little bit, what's the relationship between internal and external OD consultants. I have huge respect and admiration for my many internal OD consultant friends, and huge recognition that sometimes as an external you can do and say things that an internal can't. And that doesn't make you smarter or better. It just means you occupy a different role, but it's a role that probably sits more naturally for me.
I had a question, just going back to the idea you were kind of young and female arriving in Algeria, in a kind of male-dominated kind of environment. People will resonate with that in their own situation. What did you do to establish credibility and navigate that? Were there particular things you found effective that others might learn from?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. What did I do? I was asked quite early on to facilitate a review of the operations organisation, and I knew nothing about operations. And I went, of course, yes, of course I shall do that. And then I thought, I better go and figure out how I'm going to do this. But I have this vivid memory of being down on site, and this is not even Hassi Messaoud. This is in Salah, which is in the middle of the Sahara Desert. Like, a little bit mind-blowing. And we were in this meeting room with there were about 7 or 8 Algerian senior Sonatrach employees, 4 or 5 Americans, 4 or 5 Norwegians, on opposite sides of the table, all looking quite grumpy. I happen to speak French, so that helped me with the relationship building across. And in some ways, because I was an outsider to everyone, that was quite helpful. I wasn't another BP person or a Sonatrach person or a Statoil person. So there's something about being on the boundary that was quite helpful, but building relationships, connecting, those type of things, and actually being a little bit creative and irreverent. So I got them making de Bono paper hats and saying, actually, I want, instead of you being the Sonatrach person, I want you to be the positive person and I want you to be the critical person. And there was something about bringing in processes and ways of being that worked. And I was very obviously different, and I just kind of had to be okay with that. And again, we might talk about this in the context of the research that Andrew and I did. There is something about being comfortable with being on the boundary, which I think for OD and for consulting work is quite important. And British but grew up in France, I've been not quite fully in anywhere all my life. So I have a degree of comfort with that perhaps helps. So I'm not going to be fully in, and okay, that I can live with that. But that doesn't mean I don't put a lot of energy into the relationships. And actually, when I left Algeria, or when I've been there a while, people said, "Oh, we always know when you're around because you're always running around laughing. We can hear you. You're always making jokes with people." But there's something about connecting around humour that I think helps with the relationships.
Humor is an incredibly important tool, isn't it? It can be used really well, or sometimes it can be used in a damaging fashion, can't it, as well? So sometimes it's gallows humor, but that kind of sort of helping people build that connection, because the small talk is what allows you to do the big talk, isn't it?
Yeah. And a bit of self-deprecation is a wonderful British trait, actually. Of there are things that laughing at yourself with others can be really helpful in avoiding a big power differential.
Yeah. And I just one thing, because we were talking to Dave Snowden the other day, and one of his sort of change methodologies is about creating anomalies to create change.
I was just a giant walking anomaly in Algeria.
That's where my question is going. Is this the fact that you are an anomaly, like just
in that context?
Just you being.
I particularly was, in that context.
Yeah. So, how did you see the organisation start to operate differently as a result of you building these connections and this not irreverent, but just like building those connections in this way?
So there was a little bit of, I probably played a bit of a, is it Maven? Do you know in Gladwell's Tipping Point, he talks about mavens, people who sort of connect. I probably had a bit of that role. So I was good friends and close with some of the Algerians. Probably that came a bit more naturally to me because of language and age and a number of things. But I was also able to relate really well to my BP colleagues and my Statoil colleagues. So there was something about the ability to create connections that I think played a part. And then the other thing, I remember something I set up really deliberately that made a huge difference is I created a different collective conversations. And as I think through my career, and I still find myself doing this today, I created a forum where we talked about how particular members of staff were developing, had developed, were going to develop, but I got people talking about it together. And that shifted perceptions of it shifted how people were perceived. It shifted, we think Anwar, we can all see how much progress Anwar has made. I hope Anwar gets to listen to this. We all see how capable he is. We all see the potential. So there was something about creating collective awareness and conversations. So it was both developing individual relationships that were strong and hosting and holding collective spaces. And I think I always do that, actually. These conversations always get you thinking. I'm always doing a lot of individual and collective.
One question I wanted to ask as well is that you've been out in the field, you're doing this extensive work in Algeria, different kind of places, and then you go to Ashridge and do the consulting, which is when the theory really comes in as well. How did that sort of shape your approach, and what were some of the big insights you took away from the consulting?
It's a really good question. So actually, after BP, I went to a small consultancy who did employer brand. I was there for 3-4 years, and they were really generous. They funded me to do my master's at Ashridge, and I knew a few people who had done it, and I thought, I didn't want to do the master's too soon in career, but I felt like I had enough material to work with. And it was brilliant and life-changing, and undoubtedly one of the best things I've ever done in my career. For me, the difference in it was I went from I've read the slide to I've read the book, and a grounding that doesn't come from reading the slide, that comes from not only reading the book, but then having to write about it. And actually, I quite often these days am involved in OD capability development, often in-house. And a real challenge is often there is learning that comes from having to write and having to recreate content. And that is a normal expectation of an academic type, A-level, university, masters. It's harder to create that expectation in a corporate piece of learning, and yet from a learning perspective, I think it really is critical. So there was something about the depth that you had to go into in terms of reading, the need to produce things, and the criteria in that master's was really all about reflexivity. So there were also quite a few really critical moments of having to examine your own practice and how you were getting in your own way, which were incredibly helpful. And you were put in situations where you had to go and do things that at some level were a bit confronting, but I just had huge learning. So it was a really transformational part of my career. And although it was a long time ago, I still draw a lot from that. And it gives me a sense of, I know the ground I stand on, that I didn't have in quite the same way before.
Yeah, and you said it was life-changing. Obviously, we'd be remiss of not to explore that just a little bit more depth. Was the change gradual or cathartic and fast? Like how do you sort of change your perspectives?
Yes, and let's play with polarities. I think what was really significant for me was you got into, and I can never remember which means what, but you got into your epistemologies and ontologies, and why do you believe what you believe? And that was significant and quite, almost quite immediate, of actually, because the world that I bring a lot of my attention to is the world of people and organizations. Well, actually, that social constructionism, so that, and I still sometimes work on this with clients. It's like, well, is this a machine? Is this something else? Is it a complex system? What might that mean? And that was probably actually pretty immediate, within a year or two. Some of the reflexivity stuff was too. So when I did it, early 30s, I think. And you had to go and get some feedback from a client on a piece of work you'd done. So, made up all the excuses about why no client would ever give you any feedback. And then you thought, I'm actually going to have to go and do this. And I remember asking a particular client, I said, okay, well, I did this piece of work with you. Tell me about that. And I had a story in my head that I was too young and wasn't taken seriously, and I wasn't the expert, and I had to do a lot of hard work to establish credibility. And the first thing this client said to me, he said, yeah, within 5 minutes, I thought you knew your stuff and you were credible. I was like, oh, so I don't have to do all this work that I'm doing that's a thing of mine, not a thing of theirs. I still trip over myself every day. Of course I do. But that was quite transformational, that, okay, what's my stuff? What's their stuff? How do I really pay attention to that? It's a muscle, not something you've ever acquired. But that, I think, was quite transformational too.
You mentioned the research you did with Andrew Day around the call, and the paper that came out of it called Dancing in the Triangle. That was about the kind of that tricky relationship sometimes between internals and externals.
Always.
That we encounter as consultants. So just tell us a bit more about what inspired looking into that area and the kind of the metaphor you've used.
I think we both got interested in what goes on between. Originally, actually, I think we got interested in it. We both noticed all of the work that we were doing involved some kind of internal consultant, often OD, but might be HR, could be different, and a client. And we thought, but it's interesting. Sometimes the relationship with the internal OD type person is great. sometimes it's not.
Mm.
What's all that about? And it's always there. And actually, we never pay, in the OD literature, there's a lot on clients and contracting, but there isn't very much on the notion of it as a triangle. So it started from a place of curiosity around what goes on with our OD friends over there. But then it helps us sort of paint this picture of a triangle. And I think, both he and I, as we speak often, go, goodness, we use this every day. Every day we come back to, wait a minute, who's in the triangle? What's the contract? Are they playing their role? Can they play their role? What are some of the games? But it started from the curiosity of what goes on between the internal and OD consultants. And I guess maybe part of the reason that we were both drawn to that is we've both been internals as well as being externals. So they're perhaps more figural for us than they would be had we not had that experience.
I think it's a really good paper, and I'd recommend anybody who's listening, either whether they're the internal or the external, kind of looks at that, because it's got some really good kind of provocation and recommendations. So
Yes.
what are the kind of conditions that you found that kind of really make that collaboration effective?
Well, I think the first and foremost in many ways is I think when we think of contracts and partnerships, we often think about two and we don't often think about three. And actually, it's almost never two. I mean, at most, maybe it's two if you're coaching. And even then, there's a kind of often a bigger system. But actually, if you're doing OD work, you'd be very lucky to have just a two-way partnership or contract, because...
Can you do effective OD work if it's just two of you? Yeah.
So even just shifting the picture that I might see in my mind as I think about this is not two partners, it's a triangle. And actually, of course, as soon as we present it, some smart ass goes, well, I've got a pentagon. We go, well, of course you do. but the point is, it's not just two. So triangle is is again another simplification. But I think the first kind of big thing that comes out of it for us is this notion of thinking in more dimensions than just two. So I think that is a really important one. And then you keep coming back to the basics and fundamentals of who is the client, what is the contract, what is the three-way contract? Have we had that three-way contracting conversation? Have we named our needs? Those type of things. If I'm going to be able to name my needs, I need to be doing that work around myself as instrument and others. So you keep coming back to that. And what's the ongoing quality of those conversations? So, contracting as a verb, not contracting as a noun. Are we coming back to them? Are we making sense of what's happening? And I think, that the condition of success, which can be hard to hold on to in virtual organizations, matrixed organizations, all that good stuff, is some good time for sense making. And any time I find myself working well with a colleague, be they internal or external, we're okay with space for, what did you think? What do you think was going on? I think this, and that kind of free flowing, okay. And knowing and understanding the value of that and protecting that, really critical. There's sometimes some work to do to get both, your client and your internal person aware of the need for that space.
And I guess the challenge is that, because that's essential, isn't it? But often, and it's not...
What's this meeting for? What are we going to do? What are the action points?
Sense make? What? Well, that'd be nice, wouldn't it?
Hugging trees next.
But it's essential, isn't it? And I think sometimes, for consultants, that's just has to be, if you're an external, it just has to be priced in. It's just that is an essential ingredient that lubricates the contract to work well, doesn't it?
Yeah. And my challenge has never really been about the pricing for it, but it's more, I've had great experiences and not such great experiences in making it a legitimate activity. So, at worst, I've worked with change managers, quote unquote, who are running a project plan in a very mechanistic way. So there's a 30-minute project plan review, and it's on Tuesday at 3:00, and we look at the project plan and off we go. And I'm like, well, this hasn't really, there's no space for sense making. It's a kind of tick list, checklist piece, and you need some of that sometimes. But it delegitimizes, then actually we need a more open flowing, what are people noticing, what's going on, what are you picking up on? And when things are being run in that kind of overly rigid paint by numbers project management, then it can become quite hard to make it legitimate to have a more open conversation. unless you subvert some of the project management processes. You can do that. I've done that. We're going to have a risk session. It's going to be, because you can build that sense making into things like a risk session if you design it in a certain way.
Brilliant. And the other thing you talk about really nicely in that paper is the parallel process and how that kind of plays shows up and what that does. Can you explore, just articulate that a little bit more for us?
Yes. So, and again, I think it does come back to this, awareness of self, awareness of others, is just thinking, and particularly when you have a consulting team, you can sometimes find yourself split or oh, they like you and they really value you, but not so much me. Sometimes it might just be a case of not the right fit. And I think we have to, be thoughtful about that. But sometimes that might be that whoever that consultant is bringing in something that the system can't hear, and rejecting them is a continuation of a pattern of rejecting something in the system. So again, that paying attention to that in the team and not taking everything at face value, I think is a really important part. I jokingly with a colleague this week, we were doing some work with some couple of execs stepping into leadership roles, and we jokingly said, "Oh, are you? If we were them, would you be Pete and would I be Sally, or am I Sally and are you Pete?" So just that, what's going on here? What might we in our team be replicating that's in their system? I sometimes, I maybe have quite a strong get things done. Sometimes I can get seduced into, yes, we'll just jump to some action without really thinking through what might be going on here. Sometimes the system is inviting that in me.
And I love what you're saying there, because there's one thing, there's so much value in that. And I think people need to rewind that and listen to that again, and definitely read the paper. It's very easy, if you haven't done the work on yourself in terms of doing the reflexivity, writing the papers, thinking about, how you see things, that you could very easily take it really personally.
Yes.
I'm being rejected. You don't like me. What am I doing?
I'm not capable.
All these little things in my life. Oh, it just tells me everything in my life. It's not often that, is it? Sometimes it is, but most of the time it's not. And that's, how do you do that as a team or an individual, to be aware of that?
I mean, bless him. I often call Andrew, go, can I just, this is happening. And there is something about that really informal peer supervision piece with others who have done their work and actually being formally or informally contracted for, can I just test this out with you? What are you seeing? What do you think of this? Can you help me think about that? And it's one of the reasons why I have always wanted to be in a practice rather than an individual practitioner. So there's something really important for me in Ammalo as a community of practitioners, because I think we need, particularly if you come back to this idea of working on the boundary, if you're on the boundary of a client system, then you're always at risk of being excluded. Then you have to be okay to cope with that. But if you don't have a system of your own elsewhere that you feel safe enough in, then I would argue that that's too much anxiety to hold, or at least it's a hell of a lot of anxiety to hold. So for me, there is something about that community of practice being a holding ground from which you can go out and do really good work. And part of the role of that holding ground is to be able to have some of those conversations around, is this a me thing? Is it a client thing? We know each other well enough that you can say to me, I'll call on Andrew again. A few weeks ago, I said to him, look, can I just talk to you about this? And I described the situation, and he said, you are being very critical of that client. It's unlike you to be that critical. What's that about? So knowing each other well, having that degree of challenge, knowing it's safe, knowing you're in good hands. I find all of that very hard to do on my own. I think there are things you can do on your own, of course. But back to that kind of sense-making peer supervision or proper supervision, to both and, not either or. I think some of those practices of being in community and in connection and in learning are really helpful.
Yeah, it sounds like OD's a team sport, doesn't it? And I guess one of the things you just mentioned earlier is you talked about building internal OD capability.
Yep.
Which is really important, isn't it? I'm assuming when you're building internal OD, you're not just building OD practitioners. These are people that have got other jobs that you're weaving an OD lens into. What does that look like, and what's
Or
enough
a
to get people
mix,
up and
right?
running?
So sometimes you have people who have OD roles. Sometimes you have, often it's HRBPs who are looking to stretch into more of that OD space. And so that, there is a piece that is some skill build and theory and exercises and all those kind of things. But I think there's also, when we do it really well, there's something about, so I think about a lovely piece of work I did with a colleague last year where we built some OD skills in the HR function, but actually we did it as an inquiry into the effectiveness of the HR function. So coming into the workshop, they had to go and do some inquiry with the broader system around how is the HR function perceived and what do we do well and what do we not do so well. And then in the course of the workshop, we did some skill stuff. We talked about metaphors for organization and contracting skills and OD cycle and all that kind of good stuff. But we also said, and so what are we learning now about ourselves as a function and a system? And what are we seeing? And what might we do now? And it led to them actually making some changes to how they were running the function and evolving their design and some conversations among leaders. So there's something about, at its best, that work can be not only individually developmental, but it's developing the team and developing the system. And it's, a 2-day workshop's never going to do it. That doesn't mean there isn't a 2-day workshop or a 3-day or 4-day or whatever, but there's what comes around that enables that capability to be used in the organization, I think is a really important question. And whether it's, some action learning, some peer coaching, some peer supervision, that just training people up to do OD and then leaving them in a system with no support. I'm not
It
sure
sounds really
about that.
interesting because it sounds as almost like that was the real commission, isn't it? It's like, because sometimes it is, let's get some OD capability, and it's like, well, they ask, well, why do you think you need OD capability? And is there something around in the way in which the team works with the rest of the organization or how it's perceived?
And what will be the conditions of success for, because if what you're doing is injecting competence into some individuals and then sending them off into an unchanged system, I'd suggest that their chances of success are quite low. So what do you need to do from a team and system perspective so that those capabilities can actually be used? Otherwise, you're just training people to become independent consultants in 5 years' time, which is fine.
It's very, very
It's
true.
so true.
Right? Because they're going to go, well, can I be heard here? Does the system see this as a role that's legitimate that can be filled by an internal person? And actually the answer to that might well be no. And if that's the case and people really have a kind of appetite and energy for OD, they probably are going to go and find a way to get that need met. Discuss.
Really interesting though. We could talk about that for hours. What do you enjoy most about the work you do, about working in OD?
What do I enjoy most about the work that I do? I love the variety. I love the pace. I love my colleagues. I love that I get to work with people I, value and have a laugh with and do some, it's both, it's fun and serious at the same time. I like the big picture piece. So I like that quite quickly you have to work out what are the key drivers for this organization? What's really going on? What do we need to pay attention to? So there's an intellectual curiosity. Because I have quite a large ego, I like the fact that it comes with a degree of influence and impact. So although I might not have a, gold watch and a fancy car, I feel I can have quite significant impact. And I enjoy that. It might be subtle in the way it's done, but then, I can walk away and go, actually, there are some things in this system that are different.
And what do you find on the flip side most challenging about the role or the work?
Not much. It's a really good question. This might have to be cut. What do I find challenging? So if I answer the question differently, and then maybe something I didn't say about what I most value about it is autonomy. So actually what I value is autonomy. So I get to make the call about, I think this is good work, worth doing. Actually, if you're asking me to do something that I really don't believe in, I just don't have to do it. And likewise, if you're saying I have to, rock up at 11 p.m., there's a freedom across life and work so the degree of autonomy that it affords me is really valuable to me. And I guess what I have found challenging about it earlier in career, and it's a bit different now at this stage in the configuration that I have set up, but earlier in career, I think I found some of the internal politics challenging. So I found it challenging when I could see what needed to happen in a system, but I just wasn't in a position to be able to make that happen. And I found that really tricky. And I guess I've had situations where I probably wasn't the right person for a client, or the client wasn't the right person for me. So that there's something for me about when you're asked to do things that really don't make sense to you, I find that very challenging. And therefore, I've designed my professional life in a way that I'm not forced into those situations, which is probably why not that much. Sometimes as an external, I find it challenging not to have as many touch points as I might have if I was internal. Mm-hmm. Sometimes I think, if I was in the office, I could get a lot done over, and as an external, you don't have quite that degree of access. You have more weight when you do say something. So those are trade-offs.
Yeah, it's more set piecey, isn't it? When you go in, it's like you're going in to do a thing about a thing, or you're going to have like a series of meetings. And one thing that Danny was talking about in the pre-meet that we did with you, which is how the external person can say something that the internal people have been saying for years. Yeah. And just because you announce it, all of a sudden, like, oh, that's a genius idea. We should do that.
And you need to check yourself in that, right? You need to just remember that a role gives you certain things, and just don't disappear up your own backside with your own self-importance on that. And I think there is a trick. It probably comes back to some of what we were talking about at the beginning. I think there is a trick as an external about how do you not just do the set piecey. So how do you create those really quick, trusting relationships with key individuals where you can. So I sometimes will go, you know what? I need to speak to that person, and I'm going to need to be able to text them and go, I need 5 minutes with you. So there's something about creating good enough relationships that you're not limited to the set piece, because it's not all about the set piece. But as an external, yes, probably a lot of what you do is host the collective, more visible pieces.
Because things move on, don't they, between those kind of set piece interactions? The world doesn't stop.
And individuals are always on their own journey, as well as the team being on their journey. And I think it's something I've gotten better at as I've gotten older, of spotting when do I just need to lean in and not just wait for the next set piece to come along. Sometimes you go, you know what, I need to make a phone call and step out of the set piece-ness.
And when you think about the field of OD at the moment, is there anything particularly catching your eye that you're kind of interested in or kind of researching?
I mean, I think me and everyone is curious about AI. There are some obvious ways where you go, actually, it can help, analysis, those type of things. Is it a useful intern? Yes, there are things you can do. That's great. But beyond, more broadly, what are the impacts and the, consequences of that, both in terms of, where I think about a client I'm working with at the moment, new CEO promoted to CEO, stepping in, wanting to engage the leaders around him meaningfully, getting some support from my colleague and I. But 2 years from now, does he go, well, I'll just get AI to ask them all what they think. And then AI will tell me, and then we can have a conversation based on that. And do I need... And the question isn't so much, will I have a job? But it's, well, what's the consequence of that? So I don't have any answers, but I sit with those questions. And again, I think as many people do, not just in OD, if you take out all the learning roles, how do people learn? So got a question, I think, around that, and probably a broader question of, as the world gets more and more polarized, what is our role in that, and how easy is it for us to kind of stay in our little bits versus build connections and connectivity across organizations, functions, teams, sectors. I think that's something that's been I've really enjoyed over the last 3-4 years. I remember speaking about this at the ODN Europe conference about 3-4 years ago, and I see some great examples of this. I think you guys doing this podcast is a great example. I think Julian Chender there's something about the field needs growing and nurturing. It doesn't need people competing with each other in the field. So I'm always delighted when I can contribute to growing the field, and sort of trying to inject some of that is another. And I see good examples of that from others, which I think is heartening.
fairly big question. When you look back at your career so far, what are some of the biggest lessons that you've learned and that you take forward?
Biggest learnings, be yourself because everyone else is taken is probably one of them. So I'm not sure I have it in me to be a great internal person. That doesn't make me good, bad. Otherwise, it's just what's going to work well for you. And knowing those types of things, I think, is really helpful.
And liberating as well, isn't it?
And liberating. Just going, look, I can be a really good follower of people who I admire, respect, and think highly of. Others can follow people who perhaps they kind of are more tolerant around that. And I wish I could, but I can't. I really wish I could because it's quite inconvenient at times to be incapable. But okay, so, live with that. I think if you are interested in OD, I do think there is, do the theory work at some point. Don't do it too soon, but I do think actually the deep learning, whether it's a master's or a doctorate or people will find their own paths to that, but investing in some deep learning, I think, is an important part of that journey, and surrounding yourselves with others you can learn with and from and continue to learn with and from, I think is another really important one. Those are probably some big ones. Yeah, hold yourself a bit lightly in it. Have some fun with it. Mm-hmm. The situation is hopeless but not serious, as that Civic would say.
That is so true. The lightly bit is really important, though, isn't it? Because it is often, it's serious. It can be very serious work. It can be a lot of pressure, or you pick it up on the system and that as well. So yeah. that holding yourself lightly is really important, isn't it?
And it does. I mean, it comes to that kind of famous Maya Angelou quote of, people will forget everything, but they'll remember how you make them feel. If you're holding yourself very tight, that has an impact. If you can both be serious and light, I think you probably serve your clients better. You create space for things to be voiced, spoken, heard. That it is important.
And you're very busy at the moment because obviously you're in the process of launching Ammalo, so yep. Giving life to this. But a question that we always ask is like, how do you invest in your own learning and development? What do you do to stay sharp?
Yeah, I call Andrew. That's what I do. Andrew, what's going on here? No, it's a really good point. So there is a piece around learning, reading. For me, it's the peer supervision, and I actually have someone I work with three weeks a month. So I have an hour 3 weeks a month with somebody for whatever is going on for me. But it forces. I'm very extroverted, so if someone said, "Well, journal every day," the truth is I wouldn't. I'd do it for a week or two, and then I get bored, and it wouldn't give me the external reference I need. So I actually invest in, as I say, 3 weeks out of 4, I have an hour with someone for whatever is going on for me, but it helps me stop, pause, focus on where I need to focus. So that is built into my practice.
I'd imagine that's important as well, isn't it? Because if you think about the velocity of the work that you do, and sometimes it forces you to sort of take a step back and make sense of all the things that are happening right now, doesn't it?
And actually, I think the other thing I would say is work in pairs or trios. I think it's very tricky to do good OD work on your own. I think that sort of critical friend, other perspective, what are you seeing? What am I seeing? Maybe there are others who can fabulously do this on their own, and more power to them. But I think I do better work, and we do better work in pairs and trios than on our own.
Yeah,
I think we'd echo that, I think, wouldn't we?
Well, we had a thing a couple of weeks ago. Danny had COVID, unfortunately. So we got the result, but like as an individual doing it, like it was a lot of systemic change. There was a lot of forces going on. It's a huge amount, isn't it? So having that second person to say, okay, and holding it together, and one person looking at content, one person looking at process as well.
And actually, I was speaking with a former client earlier this week, and we were sort of reflecting on some work that I'd done with her. And she said, when you first showed up as a pair, I was a bit like, I need 2 of them. I mean, one's good, but 2. And she said, actually, over time, I really valued having 2 of you. You brought different things, huge respect and admiration for each other. So, there's something about you work as a pair when you have, you're well, as I'm sure you guys are, you know each other, you're not competing, you're able to call each other out, all that good stuff. But I think it's hard to hold all the different levels on your own in your head. And I think you learn and do better work in pairs and trios. And that might not always be that you're both there, but I've certainly had instances where I've phoned a friend at a lunch break and, kind of gone, what should I do this afternoon? but even that, I'm not sure it's an individual sport, really.
It's an optional question for you. Is there a particular book or a podcast or a resource that you'd recommend others read that's really kind of...
Block. Always block. Yeah. Always start with block. If all else fail. So, the root of all evil is poor contracting. So in many ways, if you were going to read one thing and only one thing, I would probably start with Peter Block. So I often find myself recommending Peter
Flawless
Block.
Consulting.
Flawless Consulting. Yeah, absolutely. But, millions of other things as well. But probably the one that I recommend most often is probably, maybe particularly for people who are newer to the field or coming into the field, that's probably a place where I often start. Yeah, there are other things. And the other piece, I recommend this podcast. The other one I sometimes recommend to people is Miang Chung Judge's Just in Time series. So there are some great, depending on what people are thinking about this, I think that's a great resource. It's really obviously sad that she's no longer with us, but a great legacy. And that's one that I often send people to. And
so the last question, one of the original missions of the podcast is to inspire the next generation of OD consultants coming through. So whether someone is internal trying to sort of find their way, or someone who's just at the foothills, been stationed in an outpost in Algeria, what is your advice for that person who's coming through now?
It probably echoes some of the kind of looking back and lessons. I think reach out for mentors. I think it is. I have had. It made me feel very old. But I have had people say, "Oh, you look like an old person in OD. Would you mentor me?" And I was like, "Oh, I was that old," but sure. So I do think that it is generally a community where, or at least I would like to think it is a community where people are willing to help, support, and I certainly have done that and continue to do that. So there's a piece around find some supporters, find some people who you can learn from and with, and who will do that, and ask. And my sense is many OD people would say yes, because we tend to like learning. So there's something about asking. I think there is something about do the theory. If you think this is somewhere where you want to spend a chunk of your professional life, I would invest the time in the theory learning and find good people to work with and from. I think about this idea of where's a good place to work from. If you're the only person in a system trying to do OD fairly early in career, that's going to be quite challenging. You might need to go and find a community where you can grow and develop. And then it might be easier to go back and be more isolated in a system. But you do need a tribe, I think. So find a way to join the tribe. So whether that's, the ODN Europe, joining podcasts, reaching out, but build those relationships in the community.
Brilliant. Well, Sophie, I want to say a huge thank you. Thank you so much for joining us at such an exciting time as you're just in the process of launching Ammalo as well. We've really enjoyed the conversation, haven't we, Danny?
Absolutely. It's been really, really good.
Danny, what are you taking away from the conversation?
I think it's hard to do it justice in a kind of few sound bites, but I think some of the things that struck with me, the bit you were talking about the early stage, when we're thinking about transformation, what did we used to believe and what do we believe now? A really kind of good set of questions for people to take with them. I think some of the metaphors, I just think the idea of metaphors and being really careful about which ones we use and what they might be communicating is really, really valuable. And I love what you said about kind of making sense, making a really legitimate activity and finding ways to hook it onto other parts and how important that is.
Obviously, what's been brilliant is you've just really reminded people and engaged people in the process of contracting and the importance of it, and be three-dimensional about it as well. I think that there's always something else going on too. And then the other thing as well is it's a team sport, and where possible, do it with others. You may not have someone in the room with you, but have others that you can go to make sense, sort of to help you feel resourced as well, because it is potentially, it's really demanding work, isn't it, as well? So Sophie, I want to say a huge thank you. It's been brilliant. You're the first person who's joined us from Madrid, so that's another thing on our journey around the world. But we want to say a huge thank you. It's been brilliant. If you are watching this, someone that that's probably either an internal person or someone who is in transformation, or you're an external consultant trying to find your way, and you think, share it with them. We're always so impressed with the number of shares we get every single week. Danny, we're now in how many countries is it?
84, I think, at last count.
84 countries, which is great. So we're just continuing to be impressed by just the breadth of the audience and how people are just making sense of it. And obviously it seems like OD is such an important element for that as well. And if you have enjoyed it, then what we'd love to do is to hit the like button, because the algorithm gods love it and it means that more people see the content. But most of all, Sophie, you want to say a huge thank you. It's been brilliant. Thank you for being so generous, so honest, so open, and really just sharing some of your amazing practice. And I know that people found so much value from it. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me and making this resource available to the community. I think it's a great initiative. So on behalf of all of us, thank you very much.